Ghost hit the dirt and froze. Not a sit. Not the calm trained sit he'd been taught. Haunches down. Looked back at the handler. Good boy. No. This was the other thing. This was the thing that meant don't take another step. His whole 90 pounds dropped low, ears pinned, and a sound came out of him that wasn't a bark, a low, thin whine. Almost nothing. The sound a dog makes when every nerve in his body is screaming, and he's been trained his whole life not to scream. Staff Sergeant Noor Bakhtiari stopped with one boot in the air. She put it down. Slow. Exactly where it had been. Behind her, in the dark, a column of armored trucks sat dead still on a road that didn't have a name, and 40 men were holding their breath. And somewhere ahead of her, 18 inches in front of the dog's nose, buried under a skin of pale Helmand dust, was enough explosive to throw the front axle of a buffalo 100 feet in the air. Mark it, somebody hissed behind her. She was already marking it. She crouched, slow, everything slow, the way you move when fast can kill you, and pushed a small wire flag into the dirt a meter back from where Ghost's nose pointed, and the little orange ribbon on top of it hung dead in the windless dark. Number 11. 11 flags now, strung out behind her down 400 meters of road like a trail of breadcrumbs through a minefield, and the sun wasn't up yet, and they weren't through. Good boy, she breathed. Ghost. Good boy. And she clicked her tongue, soft, and the dog peeled off the find and came to her side, and the EOD tech moved up past them both with his gear to deal with the thing in the ground, and Noor and Ghost walked on into the dark to find the next one. That's where she was at 4 in the morning, on foot, in front of the whole convoy, with a dog. Now let me back up 45 minutes, because 45 minutes earlier she'd been sitting in the back of a truck where a man had put her, and the dog's head had been on her knee, and she had been told, in those words, in that tone, that she was a morale prop. His name was Kaminsky, Sergeant First Class Daniel Kaminsky, route clearance, 16 years in, a face like a clenched fist. And I want to be fair to him, because this is not a story with a villain in it. And if I turn Kaminsky into a cartoon, I've failed. He was not a bad soldier. He kept his people alive. He knew his job. But he believed the thing men in that work came to believe, that the war against buried bombs was a war of machines. He had a Husky out front, that low, ugly mine detection vehicle built to roll over a pressure plate and survive. He had a Buffalo with its long armored arm for poking at bad dirt. He had radar, detectors, EOD techs who knew their trade. He had everything the United States Army's considerable money and genius had built to find the things in the ground that were killing his men. And he had a dog, and a woman holding it. And at 3:15 that morning he'd looked at the two of them and said, "Get in the MRAP and ride." The dog's a morale prop. She didn't argue. That's the thing to understand about Noor Bakhtiari right at the start. If you think this is the story of a woman who got loud and won the fight, you'll misread her completely. She didn't get loud. She almost never did. She'd learned the lesson a lot of quiet women in uniform learn, that the loud ones get managed and the quiet ones get watched, and she'd rather be watched. So she clicked her tongue once. Ghost stood up out of the dirt, and the two of them climbed into the back of the MRAP, and she pulled the heavy door shut and didn't say one word. And then, 40 minutes up that road, the Husky died. I don't mean it hit a bomb. I mean it broke. A driveline, a transmission, something mechanical and stupid and final. The vehicle just lurched and stopped and would not move, dead center of a stretch of road that Intel had lit up red. Confirmed enemy ID belt, multiple pressure plates suspected, the worst kind of ground there is. The machine that found the bombs was now itself a bomb-shaped obstacle blocking the only road forward. And forward mattered, because the whole reason they were rolling at 3 in the morning was a cut-off outpost. Combat outpost Finnick. A dozen Marines and a handful of Afghan soldiers, low on water, low on medical supplies, One casualty already going septic, and the convoy behind that dead husky was their resupply. Their only one. Dawn was coming, and daylight on that road meant snipers and command wire triggermen who could see you coming. They had a broken machine, a bleeding outpost, for kilometers of confirmed minefield, and maybe 2 hours of dark left. Kaminsky stood in the road in front of his dead husky with a red-lensed flashlight in his fist, and he ran the math, and the math came up the same way every time he ran it. And the answer to the math was sitting in the back of an MRAP with its head on a woman's knee. He didn't apologize. Men like Kaminsky don't. Not in the moment. Not when the clock's running. He just yanked the MRAP door open and the red light fell across Noor's face and the dog's, and he said 2 words. I need the dog. And Noor Bakhtiari looked at him for 1 second. 1 second? No longer. And she didn't put anything into it. No I told you so. No triumph. Nothing he could use against her later. And then she said, his name is Ghost. And she clipped the lead on, and she stepped down out of that truck into the most dangerous 4 kilometers of her life. Now, before that first flag goes in the ground, before I take you down that road meter by meter, and I'm going to walk every meter of it with you. You need to know who was on the end of that leash. Because a number, 19, is just a number. It's a stunt unless you know the person. So let me tell you, fast, and then we go back to the dark. Her name was Noor Bakhtiari, and she was from Fremont, California, a flat, warm, ordinary city across the water from San Francisco that happens to hold one of the largest Afghan communities on earth. They call a piece of it Little Kabul. Afghan bakeries, the smell of cardamom, old men playing cards in the afternoon. Her family came across in 2001 when she was 17. And here's the part that matters, the part that isn't the story you're expecting. Her father wasn't a silent laborer with rough hands. Her father, Habibullah, had been a professor of Persian poetry at the university in Kabul. Rumi, Hafiz, the old masters that Afghans carry in their mouths the way Americans carry song lyrics. Her mother, Soraya, had been a pediatrician with a waiting room full of children, and none of it crossed the ocean with them. His degrees meant nothing in California. Her medical license meant nothing without years they couldn't afford. So the professor of poetry ended up doing tax forms in a storefront for other immigrants, and the pediatrician ended up interpreting at the county hospital for patients who couldn't speak to their own doctors. Educated people who lost their place in the world and had to watch themselves get smaller. That was the house Noor grew up in. A house full of books in a language nobody around them read, and 2 parents who'd been somebody once, and a daughter watching all of it. There was a dog. Not Ghost. Not yet. A different dog. The first dog, and her name was Lily, and she was the reason for everything that came after, though nobody knew it at the time, because that's how the important things work. They don't announce themselves. When the Bakhtiaris got to Fremont in 2001, Noor was 17 and angry in the specific way that 17-year-olds are angry when their whole world has been taken away from them and handed back to them broken. She'd been somebody too, in Kabul, not the way her parents had been somebody, but in the small total way that matters when you're a kid. She'd had her friends, her school, her language, the streets she knew, the rooftop where she used to sit. And then it was all gone, and she was in a flat, hot place full of strip malls where the other kids at school couldn't pronounce her name and asked her if her family had known Osama bin Laden. And her brilliant father did tax forms, and her brilliant mother came home smelling of hospital disinfectant. And Noor was furious, and like a lot of furious teenagers, she went quiet with it instead of loud, which is worse, because nobody can see it. And then somebody dumped a dog. That's the whole origin. Somebody in the apartment complex moved out and left a dog tied to the stair rail. A skinny shepherd mix, mutt with one ear up and one ear down, terrified of men, terrified of brooms, terrified of the sound a plastic bag makes in the wind, a dog that had clearly been hit more than once by somebody who used those things to do it. And the management was going to call animal control, and 17-year-old Noor Bakhtiari, who had not spoken more than 10 words a day to her own family in 3 months, walked downstairs and sat on the bottom step about 6 feet from this trembling animal and did not touch it and did not talk to it and just sat there for an hour. And then she got up and went back inside. And the next day she did it again. It took her 11 days. She told me that once, the exact number, 11 days, the way you remember the numbers that matter. 11 days of sitting 6 feet away, and then 5 feet, and then 3, of bringing down bits of lamb from her mother's kitchen and setting them on the step and not looking at the dog while it crept forward to take them, before that animal would let her put one hand flat on the side of its neck. And when it finally did, when the dog finally pressed its head into her palm and let out a breath it had probably been holding for its whole miserable life, something in Noor that had been clenched shut since Kabul came open. She named the dog Lily. It's a name from a poem, Layla and Majnun, the old story, the great doomed love story of the Persian world, the one her father used to recite. Majnun goes mad in the desert for love of Layla. Lily is the Afghan way of saying it. Her father, the professor who did tax forms, came down to the stairwell to see this dog his silent daughter had spent 11 days taming, and he looked at the animal for a long moment. And then he looked at his daughter, really looked at her, the first real look in months, and he said the name back to her, Lily, and then he recited a line of the poem, in Persian, soft, into the stairwell. And Noor told me that was the moment she understood her father had been watching her drown the whole time and just hadn't known how to reach the water. That's the house. That's the family. Educated, displaced, gentle, and quiet. All of them quiet. A whole household of people who'd learned that the world takes things from you whether you shout about it or not. So you might as well save your breath and watch. And a daughter who discovered, at 17, on a concrete stair, that she had a thing very few people have. The patience to sit perfectly still for 11 days and let a frightened creature decide, in its own time, to trust her. Hold on to that. The patience. 11 days. We're going to need it on the road. She did not, by the way, go straight into the army. That's another story you might be expecting. The determined kid who always knew. She didn't always know. She went to community college first, 2 years, with a vague idea about veterinary science. And she was good at it. And she ran out of money. The way you do. And she was working at a veterinary clinic in Fremont as a tech, restraining cats, holding dogs for their shots, cleaning kennels, good with the scared ones. Always the scared ones. They'd put her with the scared ones because she had the touch when the recruiter thing happened. And the recruiter thing is not what you think either. There was no flag waving. There was no patriotic awakening. What there was a war on television every single night that had her father's country in it, and a girl who understood that country and that language and those people in a way almost no one in an American uniform did, and a slow private realization that she might be one of the only people on Earth standing exactly on the seam between the two worlds. She spoke Dari. She spoke Pashto, not perfectly, but enough. She knew how an Afghan elder expected to be greeted, knew not to show the sole of your foot, knew that you drink the tea, you always drink the tea, knew 1,000 small things that get American soldiers killed for not knowing. And she thought, and she told me she felt almost ashamed of how simple the thought was. I could help. On both sides. I'm the one who could help. So she enlisted. 2007. She was 23. Old for a recruit. And here's the part that's almost funny, the part the army does so well. This woman, fluent in 2 Afghan languages, with a war full of Afghans on the news every night, with exactly the rarest and most valuable skills set a person could walk in the door with. The Army's testing and sorting machinery looked at all of that and assigned her to the military police. Not linguist, not civil affairs, not intelligence. Military police. I'm not even going to editorialize. You can do that yourself. But here's the thing. Here's the turn that makes the whole story. The military police is where the Army keeps its working dogs. The K-9 program. And somewhere in her first year, a kennel master at a training course watched Private Bakhtiari handle a green dog, a washout, an animal that was failing out of the program because it was too anxious, too reactive, too much. And he watched this quiet woman get down on the ground and go still, completely still, and wait, and let that ruined dog come to her. And he pulled her aside afterward and said, "Where'd you learn to do that?" And she said, "A stairwell." He didn't know what that meant, but he put in the paperwork to send her to the dog program, and the United States Army, having spectacularly wasted her languages, accidentally, blindly, put Noor Bakhtiari exactly where she belonged. She trained as a military working dog handler, and then she specialized because she had the temperament for the hardest specialty there is, explosive detection. Bomb dogs, the dogs that walk in front of everyone. And somewhere in Lackland, in Texas, in the kennels there, they put her with a dog named Ghost. He was a German shepherd, sable, big, with a black face and a pair of eyes that didn't miss anything. And his name was Ghost because he'd come in pale as a pup, almost silver, before his coat came in dark, and the name had stuck even after he turned. He was not an easy dog. He was a brilliant dog, which is not the same thing and is often the opposite. The brilliant ones are difficult. They get bored. They test you. They figure out what you want, and then they decide whether they feel like giving it to you. Ghost had already chewed through one handler before her. Not literally, though he'd put his teeth on the man once. A warning, no broken skin. A handler who tried to dominate him, to make him, and Ghost had simply shut down, gone flat, refused to work, the way the smart ones do when they decide you're not worth their trust. And then they brought in the quiet woman who learned to wait in a stairwell. She didn't dominate him. She didn't make him do anything. She did the 11 days thing, compressed, because she was experienced now, and so was he. But it was the same thing at heart. She went still, and she let him decide. And Ghost, who had washed out one human already, sat in front of this one and studied her for a long time with those eyes that didn't miss anything. And something passed between them, and he chose her. That's the only way to say it. He chose her. The kennel master who watched it happen said it was like watching two people who'd been married 20 years meet for the first time. They deployed together to Helmand in the spring of 2012. By then, they'd been a team for almost 2 years, and they could read each other across a room, across a field, across a road in the dark. She knew his, "I smell something interesting," from his, "I smell something that will kill us." She knew the difference in the set of his ears between a rabbit and a rifle. And he knew. This is the part people who don't work with these dogs never quite believe. He knew her heartbeat. He could feel through the lead, through the air, through whatever it is dogs feel through when her pulse came up. And when hers came up, his came down. And when his came up, hers came down. The two of them trading calm back and forth like a current, so that neither of them was ever as scared as they should have been, because the other one was holding part of it. That's the team Sergeant First Class Kaminsky called a morale prop. That's the team that stepped down out of the MRAP at 3:55 in the morning, into the red wash of his flashlight, onto 4 kilometers of confirmed minefield, with a broken machine behind them and a bleeding outpost ahead, and maybe 2 hours of dark left to do a thing that the entire armored, radar-equipped, multi-million-dollar genius of the United States Army had just failed to do. A woman who learned patience on a concrete stair. and a dog she named for a love poem. Now we walked the road. The first flag had gone in the ground at 3:58. I told you that already. Number 11, where I started, was deep into it. Let me take you back to the first one, because the first one is where Kaminsky stopped breathing for a second, and it's where you understand what kind of night this was going to be. She didn't run Ghost the way the manual draws it up. The manual has you working a grid, methodical, back and forth. But she knew her dog, and she knew the ground, and she knew something the manual doesn't say out loud, which is that in the cold hours before dawn the desert gives up its smells differently. The explosive vapor sits low, doesn't rise and scatter the way it does in the heat of the day, pools in the disturbed soil where somebody dug. The dark was their friend. The thing Kaminsky had used to dismiss her, "I've got husky for that," was actually the worst time of day for a machine and the best time of day for a nose. So she didn't grid. She let Ghost flow. She walked the crown of the road, the high center line where the foot traffic packed it hard, and she let the dog cast left and right at the end of the lead, reading the edges, reading the soft spots, reading the places where the dirt had been turned and tamped back down and watered to set it, because they water it. The ones who plant these things, they water the patch to hide the disturbance, and that water carries the smell up. Ghost knew water and turned earth. Ghost knew the particular ugliness of homemade explosive, ammonium nitrate, the fertilizer bombs, the cheap, reliable Helmand recipe. 40 meters out, he stopped. Saturday. Looked back at her. Calm. The trained final response, the clean one, the one that means here, and I'm sure. She marked it. Yodi came up, and the tech, kneeling over the spot with a probe and a brush and a heartbeat you could have counted from 10 meters, uncovered a pressure plate the size of a license plate wired to a yellow palm oil jug packed with maybe 20 kilos of homemade explosive, buried right in the wheel rut where the husky would have rolled. Would have rolled, would have been rolling, if it hadn't broken down 100 meters back. 20 kilos. Enough to gut the vehicle and kill the crew and leave a crater you could bathe in. Kaminsky looked at the jug coming out of the ground. Then he looked at the dog. Then he looked, for 1 second, at Noor. He didn't say anything. But that was the moment. I've thought about that moment a lot. The moment a hard, competent man watches his entire framework of the world get a crack in it. And to his credit, and I want to give him this credit, because he earned it, he did not double down. A smaller man doubles down. A smaller man finds a reason the dog got lucky. Kaminsky just keyed his radio, dead quiet, and told the column, "We're walking the dog out front. All stations, we move at the dog's pace. Nobody crowds the dog. Nobody crowds the dog." That was the closest thing to an apology she got that night, and it was enough, and she didn't need more, because she wasn't doing it for him. Then she did it again, and again, and again. I'm not going to walk you through all 19, because that's not how the night felt, and I don't want to lie to you about how it felt. It didn't feel like 19 separate victories. It felt like one long-held breath that lasted 6 hours. It felt like a tightrope where the rope keeps going and the ground never comes up to meet you. Find. Mark. Wait. Yodi. Move. Find. Mark. Wait. 40 meters, 60 meters, the column crawling behind them at the pace of a dog's nose. The sky in the east not light yet, but thinking about it. That deep, ugly gray that comes before gray. But I'll give you 3 of them, because 3 of them tell you who she was. The 7th find, Ghost wouldn't commit. He'd done 6 clean ones, textbook, sit and stare. On the 7th, he got into a patch of road, and his nose came up, and he started working it, casting, agitated, but he wouldn't give the final response. He'd start to sit, and then pop back up and recast. And a younger handler, or a handler who didn't know this dog, would have called it a no find and moved on, or worse, would have forced him, corrected him, made him sit on a spot he wasn't sure of just to have an answer. Nor did neither. She read him. She understood that he was telling her something is here, but it's wrong. It's not where it should be. The smell is moving on me. And she pulled him back, all the way back, and she got down on one knee in the road. In the road, on a confirmed IED belt, in the dark, and she watched the dust. There was a breath of wind. Just a breath. The first stir of the dawn air starting to move. And she understood. The explosive was buried, but the trigger wasn't where the smell pooled. There was a command wire, an actual wire, running off to the side of the road to a firing position, and the disturbed earth over the wire was carrying scent in a thin line that the new wind was smearing sideways. Ghost wasn't confused. Ghost was tracking a line, not a point. She let him follow the line, slow, and he took her right off the road's edge to a little hump of dirt 30 meters out where the triggerman would have crouched, and the wire ran from their back to a daisy chain. 3 jugs, linked, set to blow under the middle of the column, under the trucks full of men, not the lead vehicle at all. The smart kill, the one that gets the most of you at once. Yodi found the whole chain because a dog wouldn't sit on a lie and a woman wouldn't make him. The 12th find is the one that got into her. Ghost alerted, sat, clean, and then, while the EOD tech was working it, the dog did something he wasn't supposed to do. He pulled toward Nor and pressed his whole head into her stomach and stood there shaking. And she knew her dog, and she knew that wasn't fear of the bomb. Ghost wasn't afraid of bombs. That was the whole horror and the whole gift of him. He'd been built not to be. This was something else. This was the load. 6 hours of total concentration, of every nerve at full extension, of a working animal asking his own body for more than a body has. And the body was starting to come apart. Dogs burn out on these jobs. They have a tank just like we do, and his was going dry. So she knelt down in the dirt, and she did the thing from the stairwell. She went still. She put one hand flat on the side of his neck, where she'd put it on Lily 11 years before, and she let her own heartbeat slow down on purpose so he could feel it through her palm. That current they traded back and forth, and she breathed for both of them for 30 seconds while a war waited, and then Ghost lifted his head and shook himself once, nose to tail, and went back to work. Kaminsky saw that too. He told me about it years later. Yeah, I'll get to how I know all this. Hold on. He said he'd watched a lot of handlers and a lot of dogs, and he had never in his life seen a human being put a wild animal's heart back together with one hand in the middle of a minefield. And he said it was the moment he stopped thinking of her as the dog's accessory and started understanding that the dog was hers, body and soul, and that he, Sergeant First Class Daniel Kaminsky, route clearance, 16 years in, had almost left the most important member of his element in the back of a truck because he decided in advance what a quiet woman with a dog was worth. The 19th find came at 4 minutes past 10 in the morning. The sun was up hard by then, the dark long gone, the easy time long gone, and they were almost in. Combat outpost Fremont was in sight, low mud walls shimmering in the heat. Marines on the wall watching this impossible slow-motion convoy crawl the last few hundred meters behind a dock. And Ghost, who had been running on empty for 2 hours, who Nor had been nursing find to find, sat down one last time, 40 meters from the gate, on a culvert under the road, the obvious spot, the lazy spot, the spot a tired enemy plants when he's run out of cleverness. And EOD pulled the biggest charge of the night out from under that culvert. An artillery shell daisy chained to 2 more jugs, the one that was meant to take the resupply right at the threshold, right where everybody relaxes, right where you let your breath out because you can see the gate. 19. 6 hours and change. For kilometers. Not a scratch on a single man in that column. They walked through the gate of Fennec a little after 10:30. The Marines on the wall didn't cheer. You don't. Not for that. You're too wrung out, and so are they. But the company gunny came down off the wall and walked straight past the trucks, past Kaminsky, past all of it, and he crouched down in front of Ghost and asked, "Can I?" And Nor nodded, and that hard old gunny put both hands on either side of a German shepherd's face and pressed his forehead against the dog's forehead and stayed there for a second. And then he stood up and looked at Nor and said, "Ma'am, that animal carried my whole platoon today. What's his name?" And she said, "Ghost. And he's not done, so we're going to get him some water and some shade, if that's all right with you." The septic casualty got flown out 40 minutes later on the bird the resupply convoy had escorted a clear road for. He lived. His name was Lance Corporal Diego Mata, 19 years old, from El Paso, and he is alive today, married, 2 kids, drives a route for a beverage distributor, and he does not know. To this day, he does not know that he is alive because a dog wouldn't sit on a lie and a woman wouldn't make him. He just knows they flew him out and patched him up. That's how it usually is. The people who get saved almost never know the shape of the thing that saved them. It's just an ordinary Tuesday to them, ever after. That's not a tragedy. That's the whole point. That's what she was there to make possible. An ordinary Tuesday for a kid from El Paso for 50 years to come. Now, you're waiting for the injustice. I know you are, because you've watched these before and you know the shape. Here's where the man takes the credit. Here's where the award gets buried. Here's where the system grinds her down. And I have to tell you something, and I want you to hear it clean. That's not this story. This is the part where I tell you the truth, and the truth is that nobody robbed Nur Bakhtiari. Nobody buried her paperwork. Kaminsky didn't take her credit. Kaminsky did the opposite, and I'll show you what he did. There's no villain at the bottom of this. There's just a woman who was very, very good at a quiet, brutal job, and a dog who was the love of her working life, and what came after. And what came after is the part that's actually hard, not the minefield. The minefield, she could do. What came after is the part nobody trains you for. Let me tell you how I know all this. And let me tell you what happened to Ghost. I know it because I have the recording. I have 9 hours of Nur Bakhtiari's voice on a digital file, recorded over the course of 2 long afternoons in a small house in Fremont, California, in the spring of 2019, 7 years after that road. I was there because of a project, an oral history thing, veterans telling their own stories in their own words. No script, no leading, just a microphone and a person in time. And somebody had put her name on a list, and I'd driven down from the city across that water I told you about. And I'd parked outside a modest single-story house with a dried-up little garden out front, and I'd knocked. And a woman a few years younger than I'd expected, smaller than I'd expected, with gray already coming into her dark hair early the way it does for people who've burned hot, opened the door and looked at me with a pair of eyes that didn't miss anything. And I thought before she said a word, she looks like she's been waiting for something for a long time, and it isn't me. So when I tell you about Kaminsky's face when the first jug came out of the ground, that's because Kaminsky told her. And she told me. When I tell you what the gunny did, pressing his forehead to the dog's, that's her voice on the file, and you can hear, even 7 years later, what it did to her to say it. I have her describing the 11 days on the stairwell. I have her doing Kaminsky's voice, leave the dog, Bakhtiari, with that little curl on the end, and then I have her laughing, quietly, because by then she'd long since stopped being angry at him. And that's a thing too. That's a thing about her. But mostly what I have, what the whole 9 hours circles around and keeps coming back to and finally lands on, is Ghost. So here's what came after the road. They did more missions, the 2 of them, through the rest of that deployment. The story got around. It always does, in country, faster than any official channel. And by the end of the summer there were units requesting the gal with the dog, by name, requesting them specifically for the bad routes, the red routes, the ones nobody wanted. Kaminsky, to his everlasting credit, did the thing that costs a man like him the most. He wrote it up. He wrote the whole thing up, the broken husky, the 19 fines, his own decision to leave her in the truck, in his own words, in the report. He put his own bad call on paper so that her good one would be undeniable. He didn't have to do that. He could have written a clean version where the dog was always the plan. Instead, he wrote the version where he was wrong, because he understood that the truth of what she did only landed if you knew what she'd done it against. That report is the reason she got the Bronze Star with Valor. Kaminsky pinned a piece of it on, standing next to the colonel, and Nor said the only thing that almost made her cry that whole day was that Kaminsky, when it was his turn to shake her hand for the cameras, leaned in and said one sentence, quiet, just to her. I'd have left him in the truck. I'll never forget that I'd have left him in the truck. And then he stepped back into formation. So the medal isn't the wound. I told you, the system, for once, more or less worked. The wound is ghost. Here is the thing about military working dogs that almost nobody knows. And that broke something in me when she explained it, sitting in that small house, turning a coffee cup around and around in her hands without drinking from it. For most of American history, military working dogs were classified as equipment, not soldiers, not even animals, exactly, in the eyes of the regulations. Equipment, like a radio or a rifle or a truck. And for a very long time, when a dog's working life was over, when he got too old or too hurt or simply too burned out to keep walking in front of men on red routes, the disposition of that equipment was handled the way you handle equipment. They didn't always come home. Sometimes they were left in country, transferred to another unit, or, and she said this part very flat, very controlled, the voice of a woman who had decided not to break, euthanized, because shipping a dog back across the world cost money and a dog past its working life had, on the ledger, no value. The law had started to change by then. They'd begun, slowly, to fix it, to require that the dogs come home, to give handlers first right to adopt their own partners. Started, slowly, which is a comfort exactly until it's your dog and the paperwork is slow and you're getting rotated out of country on a fixed date and the dog is not. Ghost broke down on a mission in the fall. Not a bomb. Never a bomb. With him. His body. He'd been running hot for 2 years and full out for one deployment, and somewhere in there his hips started going. Dysplasia, the curse of the big shepherds, accelerated by all those miles, all those hours, all that load. And one day in October he sat down on a route to alert on a find, a real find, a good find, his last good find, and when it was time to get up and move on, he couldn't. His back and wouldn't take the weight. He tried. She told me he tried. He pushed himself up on his front legs and dragged at the dirt with his back ones and looked up at her with those eyes that didn't miss anything, and the look in them. She said the look was not pain. She said she could have handled pain. The look was apology. The dog was apologizing to her for not being able to get up, for letting her down. And she had to kneel down in the dirt one more time and put her hand flat on the side of his neck and tell him, "No, no, good boy, you're done. You did it. You're all done now." And a couple of Marines carried him off that road in a litterment for a man, and he never worked again. And then the machine of the world started to move. Her rotation date was fixed. Ghost's medical retirement had to be processed, and his adoption had to be processed, and those two clocks were not the same clock and did not care about each other. And there was a window, a real, bureaucratic, paperwork window, in which it was entirely possible that Staff Sergeant Bakhtiari would be put on a plane home to the United States and her dog would be left behind in Afghanistan as a piece of medically retired equipment to be dispositioned by people who had never seen him put his head against her stomach in the middle of a minefield because he'd run out of heart and needed to borrow some of hers. She fought it. Quietly. Of course, quietly. That's who she was. But my God, did she fight. She used the Bronze Star, the one she didn't care about. She finally found a use for it. She used the weight of it, the visibility of it, the gal with the dog reputation, every ounce of standing she'd never wanted, and she spent all of it, every bit, on one thing, which was getting a specific 90-pound German Shepherd with bad hips classified, processed, and loaded onto an aircraft. She called people. She got Kaminsky to call people. She got the gunny from Finnick, the one who'd pressed his forehead to the dogs, to write a letter, and that letter, she said, was the single most beautiful piece of writing she ever read, from a man who probably hadn't written anything longer than a text message in a decade. And it said, in the plain words of a hard man, "This dog is not equipment. This dog carried my Marines home. We do not leave him." And it worked. That's the thing. It worked, but it worked because of her, because she spent everything she had, and she told me, on the recording, in a voice that finally, after 8 hours, after 19 bombs and a stairwell in Fremont and a father reciting poetry, finally cracked. She told me that the thing that haunted her wasn't the close call with her own dog. It was the math. It was knowing that she'd had a Bronze Star to spend, and a reputation to spend, and a Kaminsky and a gunny to make phone calls, and she'd barely gotten her dog home. And that meant all the other dogs, the ones whose handlers were privates with no medals and no phone numbers and no standing, the quiet ones nobody wrote up. How many of them didn't come home? How many good dogs were dispositioned as equipment because their person didn't have a Bronze Star to burn? That's the wound, not what was done to her. What she was strong enough to prevent for one dog and couldn't prevent for the rest. The guilt of the survivor isn't always about the people who died next to you. Sometimes it's about the ones you couldn't carry when you'd only been given enough arms for one. Ghost came home. They both came home. And then I'll tell you the last part. The part in the small house in Fremont with the dried-up garden. The part where you finally understand why she'd looked, when she opened the door, like she'd been waiting a long time for something that wasn't me. And what the dog had to do with the father and the poem, and a name that means a doomed and faithful love. That's where it ends. That's part 5. The small house in Fremont. Spring, 2019. The dried-up garden. The coffee cup she turned and never drank from. I want to tell you who else was in that house, because I haven't yet, and it matters. Her father was in that house. Habibullah Bakhtiari, the professor of Persian poetry who'd done other people's tax forms for 18 years in a storefront in Little Kabul, was in the back room, and he was dying. Slowly, the ordinary way, the way the very old go. His heart, his lungs, his body finishing a long sentence. And Noor had come home from the army, had ended her career, had walked away from the thing she was better at than almost anyone alive, to come back to this house and sit with her father while he finished dying. That was the waiting I'd seen in her face at the door. She wasn't waiting for me. She was waiting for him to go, and hating herself for the part of her that wanted it over, and loving him so much she couldn't breathe, all at once, the way you do. And Ghost was in that house. He was old now, too. Old the way the big shepherds get old. The back and gone almost entirely. A little cart with wheels parked by the door that she'd strap him into so he could still get out to the dried-up garden and lift his nose to the wind and read whatever a dog reads on the air of a quiet street in California. Gray all through his black face. The tattoo, T338, faded inside an ear that didn't stand up sharp anymore. He slept most of the day. But here's the thing she told me, and this is the thing. This is the whole 9 hours collapsing down into one fact. Ghost slept in the back room. With her father. Not with her. With Habibullah. The bomb dog and the old professor, the two of them, in the back room. all day, every day, dying together at their own two speeds. And Nor told me she didn't understand it at first, why the dog had chosen the old man, why a working animal bred and built and burned out finding death in the ground had decided, at the end, to spend his last strength keeping watch over a frail old poet. And then one afternoon she'd stood in the doorway and watched her father, who could barely speak by then, lift one shaking hand and rest it flat on the side of Ghost's neck. On the side of his neck. Exactly there. The stairwell place. The minefield place. The borrowsome heart place. And her father, in Dari, in a thread of a voice, recited a line of poetry to the dog. The same poem, Layla and Majnun. The one he'd recited into a stairwell 18 years before, when his silent, drowning daughter had tamed a thrown-away animal in 11 days, and he'd realized he'd been failing to reach her. He recited it again now, to this dog, the second dog, the one she'd named, and Nor understood, standing in that doorway, that her father knew. He'd always known. He understood exactly what Ghost was and exactly what Ghost had been to her, because he was the one who'd taught her, without ever meaning to, the only thing she'd ever truly been a genius at: how to go still and wait and let a frightened creature decide, in its own time, to trust you. How to love something the world has classified as worthless and stake your whole heart on the proposition that the world is wrong. That's what the poem is about, by the way. Layla and Majnun. People think it's a love story, and it is, but underneath it's about faithfulness past all reason. About a love that the world calls madness, that has no payoff, no sense, no profit on any ledger, and that the lover gives everything to anyway, because the giving is the point. Majnun goes into the desert and loves Layla with everything he has and gets nothing back that the world would count, and the poem says, that was not a waste. That was the most valuable thing a human being ever did. Equipment, the army said. Tattoo number T338. No value past its working life. A stuffed toy she brought to a war, Kaminsky's voice implied, with that little curl on the end. And here is this animal, at the end of everything, spending the last fuel in his ruined body lying on the floor of a back room in Fremont so that a dying old man would not be alone. And the dying old man, who had lost his country and his language and his standing and his whole self in the crossing of one ocean, reaching down with the last of his strength to keep the dog company right back. The two of them holding part of it for each other, trading calm back and forth like a current. Neither one as alone as he should have been, because the other one was there. You want to know what valor is? Everybody knows the road. 19 bombs, for kilometers, a bronze star with AV on it. That's valor, and I'll never take it from her. But she didn't cry telling me about the road. She told the road steady, like a report, because the road she could do. She cried telling me about the back room, about her father's hand on the dog's neck, because that, the long, unglamorous faithfulness, the staying, the keeping watch over the dying with no medal in it and no story in it and nobody to write it up. That's the thing the world has no category for and assigns no value to and classifies as equipment. And it is the most valuable thing a living creature can do. And she had built her whole self around it without ever having a word for it. And it had taken a thrown-away dog and a dying poet to show her, finally, in a doorway, what she'd been her whole life. Her father died that summer, a few weeks after I sat with her. She wrote to tell me, a short note, her handwriting small and exact. And she told me that Ghost was there, that the dog was on the floor by the bed, that he'd dragged himself there in the night without his cart, somehow, on those dead hips, just to be there, and that her father went easy, with one hand fallen off the edge of the bed resting on the dog's gray head. And then she wrote one more line, the last line of the note. She wrote, Ghost went 11 days later. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think he was waiting to make sure my father got there first. He always knew when something was about to go off in the ground before any of us did. I think he just knew, and he held on, and then he was done. Good boy. All done now. 11 days. The same number. The stairwell. The exact patient measure of how long it takes to earn a frightened creature's whole heart, and apparently exactly how long a faithful one will hold the line at the very end, waiting, making sure you get where you're going before he lets himself go. So, leave the dog, Bakhtiari. That's how it starts. For words, a little curl of contempt, the word dog like a waste of breath. I've spent 5 parts telling you why those are the most wrong 4 words I have ever heard. Not because the dog found 19 bombs, though he did, and not because he saved a column and a kid from El Paso who'll never know it, though he did. Because at the end of everything, when there was no war left and no ledger that could see him and nothing in it for anyone, that dog lay down on a floor in California and kept faith with a dying old man for no reason the world can count, and a woman who learned how to do that exact thing on a concrete stair when she was 17 got to stand in the doorway and watch her whole life make sense. Don't leave the dog. Never, ever leave the dog.